Welcome back to the deep dive. When we talk about the global energy transition, we hear so much about cost and carbon. But there's a foundational reality underneath all of it, a thermodynamic one, and that's how much energy does it actually cost us to build the very systems that deliver our clean energy? And crucially, what happens when those resources, like sunshine and wind, are spread so unevenly across the globe?
That's the core tension right there. We're stepping back from the financial cost today and really focusing on the energetics, the physical feasibility. And the source we're unpacking for you is a deep analysis that tackles this head on. It's called Uneven Distribution of Natural Resources Impacts on System-Wide Energy Return on Investment.
Okay, so let's unpack that with the right language.
Yeah.
The first concept we absolutely need is net energy.
Right. Simply put, that's the surplus. It's the energy that's left over for society after you've paid all the energy costs to get it in the first place.
The mining, the manufacturing, the labor, all of it.
Exactly. And that surplus powers everything else. Our hospitals, our schools, our culture. If that surplus shrinks, well, everything gets harder.
Which brings us to the main yardstick here. Energy return on investment, or EROI.
EROI is that ratio. How much energy you get out versus how much you had to put in to build and run the system. It's really the ultimate metric for viability.
Okay. Now, when we look at those world maps showing, phenomenal solar potential in the Sahara or wind in the North Sea, a historical concern pops up. We've seen it with oil. It's called the Renewable Energy Resource Curse.
Exactly, the RE resource curse. It's this idea that if a region has one overwhelmingly abundant resource, they might become, overly dependent on it.
Which could lead to lopsided investments or a huge demand for certain critical materials.
And that could impose economic pressures that actually limit the benefits of the transition for that society. It's a very real looming concern for planners.
So we have this central tension. Is resource abundance a blessing or is it a potential trap? What did the researchers in this study actually conclude?
Well, they analyzed 9 regions across 9 different futures out to 2050. And here's the spoiler right up front. Their modeling found that regional EROIs are fundamentally unaffected by that uneven resource distribution.
Unaffected.
Right. They conclude that the RE resource curse is, in fact, unlikely to occur. That huge risk we worry about. They're saying the numbers just don't support it.
That is a phenomenal relief, but it's a huge claim to make. To really trust that conclusion, we have to look under the hood. How did they calculate these numbers?
Yeah, this wasn't a back-of-the-envelope calculation. They used a holistic system-wide EROI framework. And they combine that with outputs from the LUT Energy's System Transition Model, or LUT-ESTM. So it lets them look at the entire integrated system, not just, one solar panel in isolation.
And I really appreciate how they dealt with the biggest problem in comparing these systems, which is standardizing the measurement.
Yeah.
Comparing energy to run a gas plant versus making a wind turbine is apples and oranges.
It's a huge problem. And it's technical, but it's crucial. They use something called the Cumulative Energy Demand Indicator, or CED. It's derived from a life cycle assessment. So think of CED as the standardized measuring cup they needed to make it all comparable.
So it converts everything from mining copper to refining steel into one consistent unit.
Exactly. Standardized at the electricity level, it gets around all those boundary issues you have with complex systems.
And the model itself, the LUT-ESTM, sounds pretty robust. It forces them to face reality.
It does. It's a cost optimization model, operates at an hourly resolution, and includes over 150 different technologies. And crucially, that includes the high energy cost stuff like grid storage and even power-to-X systems for things like green hydrogen.
Right, because those enabling technologies, storage, transmission, PTX, that's where so much of the hidden energy cost is.
Precisely. And they ran this for 9 regions and 9 scenarios, from best policy scenarios to more conservative IEA pathways.
Okay, so after all that comprehensive analysis, what's the verdict on global viability? We hear about this EROI threshold for a sustainable civilization. Where do we need to stay?
The threshold is often seen as an EROI of 10. You need to get 10 units of energy out for every 1 unit you put in, just to sustain basic societal functions.
So if you drop below 10?
If you drop below 10, society is basically spending more energy to maintain its energy supply than it can sustainably afford. It's a fundamental feasibility metric.
And the big reveal from the study?
The light stays green. Strongly green. The analysis found that none of the regional EROIs fall below that critical threshold of 10 in any scenario, all the way out to 2050.
Wow, so that's a pretty strong confirmation that, from a physical energy perspective, the transition is techno-economically viable.
It is a very strong confirmation.
So we know the goal is feasible, But how did the transition actually start? Let's look at that baseline period they examined from about 2015 to 2020.
In the very beginning, yeah, most regions saw a modest introduction of renewables, but it was coupled with phasing out some of the most energy-intensive fossil fuels. And that initial cleanup actually led to slight EROI improvements in most places.
So they were grabbing the low-hanging fruit, but there were some big outliers, right? Regions that saw massive gains.
Oh, absolutely. South America, or SM, achieved the highest EROI in those early years. It peaked at over 36 by 2025.
Wait, 36? If 10 is the minimum for survival, 36 is just incredible. Why was South America such an outlier?
Hydropower. That huge peak was driven almost entirely by the expansion of hydropower. Once a dam is built, the energy return is just extremely high.
Right, the energy input to keep the water flowing is basically zero.
Exactly. We also saw that phasing out older nuclear power in regions like sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia also gave them a nice ERY bump, sometimes around 4 points.
That's a fascinating detail. So just shedding older high-input energy sources gives you an immediate thermodynamic win.
It does. But on the other hand, you had Eurasia, which saw its EROI trend downward by almost 2 points. That was because its overall fossil fuel consumption was still rising in that period.
Okay, so the initial phase was about cleaning up the old system. But now we look long-term. We go all in on solar PV and wind. That means building a massive amount of infrastructure batteries, transmission lines. What happens to the EROI then?
And that's where the system-wide EROI begins to trend downward, slightly but definitely downward over time, achieving that very high penetration of variable renewables VRE. It just requires those massive enabling technologies. The energy cost of making and installing all that storage and grid hardware is substantial. So you see a decline, even though it stays comfortably above that critical threshold of 10. The system just gets more complex, and complexity costs energy.
This is where it gets really interesting for policymakers. The study argues that the final outcomes depend less on geographic luck, whether you're in a desert, and far more on strategic choices.
That is the ultimate takeaway here, and you can see it clearly in their analysis of Europe and Northeast Asia. They set up two different scenarios, one where wind repowering was enforced and one with more reliance on solar.
Let's focus on Europe. In the scenario with wind repowering, replacing old turbines with new, better ones, Europe's EROI stabilized. It stayed high, around 24. Why?
Because repowering moderated the need for an explosive growth in solar PV and all the short-term storage that solar often needs to balance the grid. When you prioritize highly efficient wind, you stabilize your net energy.
But without that policy in the other scenario, Europe leaned more on solar.
And that required far more of those enabling technologies. That strategic choice alone led to a continuous ERI decline, dropping all the way down to around 18 by 2050.
So that 6-point difference from 24 down to 18, that's purely a result of a policy choice.
Exactly. It shows that your technology preference has a much bigger impact than just your local resource abundance.
And what about the EROI cost of other renewables, for diversification?
Right. Well, the analysis suggests that things like bioenergy, hydropower, and geothermal have a pretty minimal impact on the overall trends, often because they're more expensive or just very site-specific.
Take geothermal. It sounds great on paper, always on, reliable. But the study found it can come with an EROI penalty.
It can. Geothermal plants often have a really high cumulative energy demand during construction. You're drilling deep wells, building specialized infrastructure, and that's coupled with sometimes lower electrical efficiency. So as regions like Eurasia expanded their geothermal, they actually saw their EROI dip. The lesson seems to be that diversifying away from a low-cost solar and wind can actually cost you net energy.
Let's pivot to a different strategic choice. Speed. The BPS Plus scenarios tested what happens if you shorten the transition timeline dramatically. That has to create some huge bottlenecks.
It creates temporary but very acute stress. See this, the researchers use a different metric, the annual energy investment flow, or AEF. This captures the year-to-year dynamics, which get hidden when you just average the ERY over a 25-year lifetime.
So AEF is measuring the intensity of the build-out in a given year.
Exactly. And imposing a super fast transition is like trying to run a marathon in the first hour. It generated these sharp, short-term AEF declines in places like Sark and Minna.
How sharp are we talking?
They dropped dramatically, sometimes down to an AEF of 3.7 or 5. So for a short time, these regions were actually dropping below that viability threshold of 10 just to build the system.
And that's from the concentrated push to build solar and wind and all the batteries at once.
An enormous but transient energy drain.
But the key word there is transient. The system doesn't crash.
No, it stabilizes. The researchers stress that those AEF values recover quickly once the heavy construction phase is over. The bottleneck is acute, but it's short-lived. It just shows that if you want to go faster, you have to confront a temporary net energy deficit.
Let's circle all the way back to that central hypothesis, the renewable energy resource curse. If you look at a region like MENA, the Middle East, and North Africa, which is just drenched in sun, is that reliance a curse or a blessing?
MENA is the strongest argument against the resource curse. The region's future is, of course, dominated by solar. But the aggressive strategic growth in low-cost solar PV actually raises its long-term EROI to a stable 17 or 18.
That's the opposite of a curse.
It's a resource blessing. The study concludes that high reliance on low-cost renewables like solar and wind in these resource-rich regions is the superior path. The low system costs and sustained high EROI just made it the best choice.
So the abundance of solar, paired with smart infrastructure, is an advantage that just outweighs the energy cost of capturing it.
Exactly. The real vulnerability, according to this study, isn't the abundance of renewables. The real risk is falling back on old habits. They show that pathways that prolong reliance on finite fossil fuels, like the IEA STEP scenario, pose a much higher risk of a fossil resource curse in the long run.
Because you're just locking yourself into volatile, finite resources with rising long-term costs.
Precisely. And this all has real societal consequences. EROI isn't just a number for engineers. If it starts to decline, what does that actually mean for people?
It connects directly to affordability. A declining ERI doesn't mean failure, but it can definitely raise energy costs. And if you rely on high-cost, less efficient renewables, that financial burden grows, which could worsen energy poverty.
And this study notes that the longer you rely on fossil fuels, the greater that financial risk becomes. So adopting high ROI, low-cost renewables isn't just an efficiency move, it's a crucial step toward equitable and affordable energy.
That gives us a much clearer picture. To wrap this up, let's condense the three biggest takeaways.
Okay. First, the transition is strongly feasible, both globally and regionally. The ERI stays safely above that critical line of 10, so the fear about uneven resources derailing the whole thing seems unfounded.
Second, feasibility depends almost entirely on strategic choices. Specifically, prioritizing low-cost, high ERI renewables like solar PV and wind over trying to diversify with more energy-expensive alternatives.
And third, going fast will create temporary, intense energy investment bottlenecks. You'll see there's sharp drops in the annual energy investment flow. But they are transient, and the system stabilizes. We can push the timeline without breaking the system.
My final thought goes a little beyond the physics. This study gives us confidence in that physical threshold of 10. But a successful transition needs more than just raw energy ratios. For future planning, we have to integrate the human factors. The policy frameworks, the institutional capacity, managing regional inequalities, those socioeconomic dimensions are the next critical layer for a truly comprehensive picture.
A fascinating and, I think, optimistic look at where we stand.
Indeed. This was a deep dive into the findings of the study. Uneven distribution of natural resources impacts on system-wide energy return on investment. We'll see you next time.